Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Couric, and I'm here with a very special guest, Mr. Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who's agreed to give me some of his time for this online conversation. Now, I asked for questions on Twitter. We received a lot of smart ones. I'll include some of those, and of course, I have a few of my own. Mr. Blair, by the way, became Britain's youngest Prime Minister of the 20th century in 1997 and served in that role for 10 years, and those were very eventful years at that. Mr. Blair, nice to see you. Thank you for coming by.
Thank you, Katie.
I know it's Mr. Blair and not Prime Minister because I did a little research, and it's not the case that once a Prime Minister, always a Prime Minister, is it?
No, we have a different sort of convention in the UK. So when you stop being the Prime Minister, you just plain Mr. or Mrs.
That's it.
Yeah.
And in fact, I know you get some grief sometimes when you go home because here in the U.S., often people refer to you as Prime Minister Blair and they say, dude, you're no longer the Prime Minister.
Yeah, no, that's right. So what happens is that in America, they call you Prime Minister and then the guys back home say, he's under this delusion that he still is Prime Minister. And then when you say to the Americans, look, stop calling him Prime Minister, they say, well, they sort of think maybe it's been so awful for him leaving that he can't handle the fact he's no longer Prime Minister.
People reading all sorts of things into everything. Well, let me start by asking you, Mr. Blair, about Iran, because obviously that's very much in the headlines. I'm sure in the UK as well as here in this country, there was another bloody clash today, apparently outside of Parliament, although it's hard to get accurate news information because so many Western reporters have been banned. Do you think that Mousavi, the opposition leader, should encourage these protests or try to stop them in order to save lives?
I think he's going to make the calculation, and they've got to make the calculation on the ground. I mean, I can't second guess that from here. I mean, what I do think is that the change that's happening there is fundamental. I think it symbolizes something that's happening across the whole of the region. And I think that even if the regime managed to suppress this expression of popular will now, I think its roots have gone down and those will bear fruit again in the future.
I know that the Iran Supreme Leader Khamenei told Iranian lawmakers Iran will, quote, not give in to pressures over the disputed election. So clearly from your first answer, this isn't the end of it. But how do you see events unfolding in Iran? I know it's very difficult to predict, but as someone who has a wealth of experience in foreign policy, what do you envision happening?
I think it's really hard to judge from a distance, but I think probably what will happen is that the regime, which still controls through the Revolutionary Guard, the force in the country. So I think they're going to try and manage this out, suppress it where they need to, try and make sure that insofar as possible they just hope that it kind of goes away. Now, it might be suppressed, but it's not going to be eradicated because it obviously is an expression of popular will. And the people that have come out on the street, it's been different from anything I've seen in Iran for many, many years. And as I say, this is part, I think, of a change that's happening across the whole of the region, where the people who want their countries to become part of the modern world and part of the 21st century are starting to find their voice, express their sentiments and their feelings, and are determined and passionate about it, as they should be.
But how do they go from peaceful protest to actual change?
I don't know. And you never know in these situations. You just never know when something tips over. When there's a critical mass behind it, when the authorities themselves start to feel that they can't control the situation. Now, in Iran at the moment, as I say, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, they're going to come down, and they made it clear they're going to come down very hard. So it's hard to see how this evolves then over the next period of time. But I think that there are two questions. First of all, what can we do to give the people there some sense that there is solidarity being expressed with them in the rest of the world without interfering in Iran's internal affairs, etc. But how do we do that? And I think actually that is almost happening spontaneously from around the region and the wider world, with people giving voice to their own support for them. But I think the second thing, which is really difficult, is what happens if this regime then squeezes it down, regains full control, and then continues to do what the international community and what people in the region have been objecting to it doing, which is acquiring nuclear weapons capability and continuing to export chaos and instability through terrorism.
I want to ask you about the latest statements or positions by the Iranian government, basically accusing Britain of stirring the pot, if you will, fomenting these protests. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, it's ludicrous, and it doesn't. I mean, I don't think anyone seriously believes it. I mean,
where's it coming from?
Well, I think it goes back a long way. You know, I mean, the history of, as you know, when you're out there in the region, the history of Britain stretches over all of those countries, and it may be possibly as well that they feel going head on America is maybe too tough, so they use Britain as a proxy. But I mean, what does it mean? It means nothing. I mean, it's got no credibility, and the idea that Britain's trying to foment this, or that anyone actually could. Never mind Britain, America could foment it. Nobody can foment it. It's an expression of popular will, and it arises out of the fact that people simply don't believe the election result.
The Iranian government has also suggested, or the theocracy really, that they're considering downgrading their relationship with Great Britain. And then there's been this tit for tat. Iran expelled 2 UK diplomats. Prime Minister Brown responded by expelling 2 Iranians. How concerned are you, though, about this rising tension between these 2 countries?
I think the tension, which has always really been there for some time, is there as a consequence of the situation on the Iranian street and the nervousness of the regime. I don't think it's there for any other reason. So I don't know. I mean, I suspect that will play itself out as this whole popular uprising plays itself out. But the reason why this is happening in Iran is very simple. I mean, you know what it's like in election time. You don't go and check the ballot boxes. I don't go and check the ballot boxes, but you get a sense of what is happening in a country. And plainly what people had in Iran was a sense that there was a popular movement for change, that change was coming. And then they're told that actually Ahmadinejad is back with a 2-1 majority. And people just say, well, this doesn't tally with my sense and my feeling about it. And that's what's given rise to this. And it's been I don't think it's been planned or fomented by anybody.
Some Republicans here have criticized President Obama for being timid and passive in his response, although he got some props yesterday for using stronger language like outraged and appalled. We've got a Twitter question, actually. Jay Sempe asks, what is Mr. Blair's opinion on how President Obama has handled the situation in Iran?
Well, he's balancing it, isn't he? Because when a situation like this happens, what the Iranian regime will be looking for is what external enemy can we seize upon in order to divert attention. It's probably why they've started using this rhetoric and doing these things in respect of Britain. So obviously what President Obama is trying to do is to balance the fact that, of course, he feels a sense of outrage about it, but to what extent is his expression of that going to be counterproductive? Well, he's got to balance that day by day. And to be honest, I don't think that is the critical question. I think the critical question is, what do we do? Well,
that's the question I was going to follow up with, because isn't it true the U.S. and, for that matter, Great Britain and many other countries, their hands are tied. They really can't do that much to either A, influence the outcome of the election, or B, have an impact on this crackdown. What can they do?
I think you're right. I don't think there is, in the short term at least, a great deal that can be done. But I think what it does signify is that when we then come to the broader question of engagement and dealing with the Iranian regime, then obviously it is going to be part of the background to that is the knowledge that you had this election that seems extremely difficult to understand, and then you had the crackdown. So I think in the medium and longer term, what it will signify is probably a hardening of our position with the regime.
Which is kind of a shame when you think about it, if you believe that President Obama's approach of at least, low-level negotiations about Iran's nuclear capabilities is the right step for the future. It seems to me that that's been taken off the table as a result of these events.
Well, I'm not sure it's been taken off the table. In other words, I think...
For now, anyway.
Well, I think what people will do, however, is that if they come to the table, they're going to come to the table with a certain sense of what the events of the past couple of weeks mean about the nature of this regime.
So if you were negotiating, what would you say? How would it change your approach or your knowledge?
I think it would change the approach in this way. Because after all, the single most important thing for us is to bring about a situation in which they don't acquire nuclear weapons capability and they stop exporting this chaos and instability around the region. So your negotiating objective is the same as it was before. The difficulty when you're coming to the table, the negotiating table, though, is that there is another dimension to the character of the regime that you've just had a graphic illustration of.
They haven't done a lot to engender your trust, in other words.
Exactly.
In retrospect, do you think there should have been international monitors for this election? Could there have been? Would that have been permitted?
Well, I don't for a moment think that the Iranian regime would have wanted that. And remember, of course, that the numbers of candidates that even on the basis they hold the election, I mean, those candidates are heavily controlled.
Right.
And so the actual...
They narrowed it down. They winnowed it down to 4 people.
Absolutely. They slimmed the candidates down. So it's not, even in its own terms, it's not a fully free election, which makes the outcome and then the popular expression so much more dramatic in a sense and so much more telling.
What do you think the impact of the death of Neda Agha Sultan, that 27-year-old beautiful Iranian girl who was apparently shot in the chest, and she has become symbolic of this struggle and this new revolution, if you will. What impact do you think she'll have on the international conversation about this?
I think she is the face of that and the expression of it, and also the reaction that you've seen not just around the world, but most particularly in the Muslim world and in the Arab world, I think is very interesting. Because, there is a sense amongst a whole younger generation of people in these countries that, as I was saying earlier, their view is that there is the chance now of a new partnership with the West, of an opening up, of an engagement by their countries with the modern world, with the 21st century, where people get greater freedom, greater choice, greater ability to interact with others. And all of that is fueling this. And in her, in a sense, in one sense, as these things sometimes happen, a face is then put on that movement. So I think her the difference she will have made will in historical terms, I think, be quite significant.
How much do you think President Obama's election influenced this feeling in Iran, or is that typical U.S. hubris to even think so? I'm just wondering.
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I think that, look, I think all those feelings are there, and they're in any event. But I think, and this is no commentary on the American election, but it's just that at this moment in time, for him to come on the scene, being as he is and speaking as he does and having the background that he does, it's maybe hard to see from the outside, if you're in America, to see from the outside perspective what a revolutionary change that was. And, I mean, obviously I'm out in the Middle East a lot and out in that region. And I would say that, before the American election, large numbers of leaders in that region said to me, there's no way they'll elect Obama. It just won't happen. America won't do that. Then it does. And then they say, that's interesting. And for the people, and particularly after his speech in Cairo, which I think, has had a really, really significant impact. Then you see the election in Lebanon with Hezbollah pushback. You see in Kuwait, for example, an election recently, the first women members of parliament being elected. Right round the region, there is a sense of change. Now, as I say, the difficulty is further down the line, the tough challenges and tough decisions abound. But for the moment, that sense of hope, that spirit of possibility is there.
I get the fact that President Obama and the White House has to be cautious and careful about what message they deliver to Iran. They keep saying this is an Iranian problem, this isn't about the U.S. or the West. On the other hand, do you think that some of these young protesters who so believe in a just system, free and fair elections, are slightly deflated that this man, Barack Obama, who's become such a symbol worldwide, doesn't express more solidarity with them?
Do you know what I think? I actually think they're smart enough to realise he's got a difficult tactical decision. I think they'll know exactly what he thinks. I don't think any of those people out in the street in Iran, who incidentally are utterly in touch through the internet and elsewhere with the modern world, I think they will completely understand that he's trying to manage a situation in which he obviously is supportive of them, but doesn't want to end up in a situation where his attack on the regime is then used as a reason to act against them.
Right, makes things worse for them.
I remember the reason I have a certain sympathy for this is that when elections used to happen in Zimbabwe, with Mugabe, I had precisely this tactical dilemma. Because if I came in and said what I thought, which was the whole thing was a complete outrage, he was a brutal and monstrous dictator and so on and so forth, it was immediately used against his opposition. And so and people were saying to me, well, why aren't you speaking out? And the reason was not that anybody in Zimbabwe was under any doubt as to what I thought, or I was just trying to manage the situation. I think he's trying to do the same. So personally, I think if we were going to focus our attention on what is the key strategic challenge at the moment, it's not what he says in the next few days, it's what we say and do in the next few months.
Do you think John McCain and Lindsey Graham should back off of their criticism of him? Come on.
Look, I find it hard enough to avoid getting drawn into British politics without getting drawn into your place. I don't, I'm
going to try on that in a little bit. But before we just
one last question.
one last question about Iran. I mean, speaking of, how in touch these demonstrators and protesters are you amazed? Here we are, and the role of technology and what it's playing in basically disseminating this story all over the world, despite the fact they've clamped down on any semblance of a free press there?
No, because this is the world. I mean, this is the change. In my foundation, which is about religious faith and getting different faiths to work together and so on and so forth.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah. You have no idea. The power of the new technology is just extraordinary. And you get an immense feedback. You make a speech on religious faith, you get vast feedback straight away from all sorts of different strange parts of the world and places you think, I was in Afghanistan last week, and even there, which is a very poor country, very difficult, people were telling me that out in the villages and towns, people are in touch with the world.
Does any of the things you get on the internet, do they scare you, or yeah. not from a security standpoint, but in terms of
the
how
thinking?
people? Yeah,
absolutely, yeah. And one of the troubles with this too is that people have a natural appetite for conspiracy theories, and that's a bit dangerous too.
And the kinds of things they're able to write under the cloak of anonymity.
Yeah, I think there's a whole. There are huge advantages of this information revolution, and they far outweigh the disadvantages, but the disadvantages are there.
Let's talk about the West Bank, because I know you recently returned from there. Give us a sense of what is really happening on the ground. What are the practical daily roadblocks to peace in that region?
The problem with the Israel-Palestine issue, and incidentally, this is absolutely fundamental and critical to dealing with Iran, in my view.
And to so many other places where there's unrest in the region, right?
Correct.
I know you believe that, and I've heard that time and time again from various leaders in the Mideast.
It's all part of one picture, and this is very critical to it. But here's what I think is the issue. To negotiate a Palestinian state, you have to resolve some very difficult issues. I mean, what is the precise territory, the degree to which it's based on the 1967 borders and so on and so forth, Jerusalem, right of return, etc. But the problem, the on-the-ground problem when you're there, in what is a very small strip of land, if you're standing on the Jordan side, you can look out into Israel over the whole of the West Bank. So it's a small strip of land, and each side has its, what I call, on-the-ground reality concern. And the on-the-ground reality concern of the Israelis is security. In Gaza, which is down in the south, the rockets that are fired out of Gaza, I mean, they're terrible for the Israeli population in the nearby towns, but there's at least at the moment, there's a limit to the damage that can be done. But the Israelis believe if you end up getting that type of attack coming on the West Bank, which is right next door to the main centres of population of Israel, then that's unacceptable. So the Israeli on-the-ground reality concern is security. The Palestinian concern is the occupation, because the Israelis, partly because they believe there is this security threat on the West Bank, have therefore got roadblocks and checkpoints and a whole web of restrictions on what the Palestinians can do on what they regard as their own territory. And what this means is that for the economy, for example, it can be difficult for the economy to grow. It's difficult to get permissions to do things. Goods can take a long time to transport around because you've got the roadblocks and checkpoints and so on. So the on-the-ground concern of the Palestinians is the occupation. And that's why the key to resolving this is that you've got to try and build this from the bottom up. Build the Palestinian security capability to take account of the Israeli security concern, and ensure that as that is done, the Israelis lift the weight of occupation, start removing these checkpoints, deal with these issues like settlements so that the Palestinians get the run of it.
Is it going to happen?
Yes, I think well, is it going to happen? Yes, I think it can happen. It should happen.
Will it happen?
And will it happen? I hope so.
Are you optimistic about Benjamin Netanyahu kind of making that overture, even though they attach quite a few caveats to the two-state solution?
I mean, I think that's important because it means we're all heading in the same direction, two states. But there's a lot of tough, detailed work to be done.
Is enough being done now?
The new administration in America, for sure, and this is the big difference, is it started at the beginning. I mean, actually, what the last American administration did through Annapolis process is not to be dismissed. In fact, it was important. But the fact that President Obama started this at the beginning, Secretary of State Clinton obviously knows the issue inside out. Jim Jones, who's the National Security Advisor, was someone I was working with in the Palestinian territory last year. And of course, Senator Mitchell, I worked with on the Northern Ireland peace process. I mean, these are all smart, good, capable people who know this issue inside out. So that's what should give us hope.
Well, good negotiators, but you have to have willing parties.
Correct. And the problem on the Israeli side is, are they really prepared to make those changes necessary? And the problem on the Palestinian side, of course, is the split between West Bank and Gaza and the divisions on the Palestinian side. Having said all of that, it is possible to do, precisely in a way because it is a small strip of land. It's not impossible to do this.
Let me ask you another Twitter question about the perception of America abroad. Terry Gay asked, how does Mr. Blair feel the world's general impression of the U.S. has changed after electing President Obama? You sort of answered that question. So since you have a limited amount of time, don't take too long answering it now.
I mean, the answer is it's given people a fresh look at America in a different way. That's a positive.
Okay, and that's a good short answer.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about both men. Would you compare President Obama to President Bush in terms of leadership style from what you've been able to glean, knowing both men?
Well, as I always say, I mean, I work very closely with President Bush, and I think he took some very difficult and very courageous decisions. And my view of this is that, if you like, these problems require a combination of the hard and the soft power. So if we're thinking about how we deal with the problems of the region we're talking about, we're not going to win in Afghanistan, and we wouldn't have won in Iraq unless we'd stood up and be prepared to fight our ground with the necessary hard power. But in the end, we know that diplomacy is also a major part of this package, which is why the Israel-Palestine question is so important. So what I would say is that, I mean, I think, obviously the two people are very different, with very different approaches, but actually it's the combination of the hard and soft power that will be the solution to this region.
If the U.S., the image of the U.S. has been improved significantly around the world with the election of Barack Obama, does that sort of follow that President Bush wasn't good for the image of the U.S. worldwide?
What is true is that he was, indeed, in a sense, as I was, a figure of great controversy. But I also think it's just worth considering, if you look, for example, at what is happening in Iran today, and then you think, how would that be happening in the same way were Saddam still running Iraq? That's an interesting debate. So, I mean, I wouldn't ignore the fact that for the first time, for example, once Saddam was removed, you were getting pilgrims coming from Iran into Iraq. People can see that for all its challenges and difficulties, Iraq actually is a democracy. So
You also have a lot more Al-Qaeda in Iraq, too.
Yes, although actually as a result of what American forces and the British forces have done, I think they have been actually beaten back significantly
with
there.
the Anbar awakening and the Sunnis and the U.S. and
but
Brits.
Also the fact that and this will be exactly the challenge we face in Afghanistan. They met a determination to stand up and fight back.
We received a couple of questions about American domestic issues, and I was actually interested in hearing you talk about this as well. Sarah 718, that's her log on, asks on Twitter.
I thought you were asking me about it. There was an issue called Sarah 718. I was thinking, what's that?
You were thinking, what bill was that? Yeah. What lessons can you give Americans in terms of the challenges and benefits of nationalized health care?
I took over in 1997 an underinvested in healthcare system, but was very monolithic. And we had a mantra there, which was we had to put the necessary money in, but we had to reform the system. And my own view is that the system that works best is a system that, if you like, has as obviously our system has got universal spread in the UK, but we had to reform it very substantially to make it more efficient, more competitive, to give the patients more choice. And, you know, I don't think it's quite as stark a choice as people sometimes make out between, as it were, you know, you've got this American healthcare system here and this absolutely state-run...
socialistic.
Yeah. I mean, we found that we had the benefits in the British National Health Service. We made a lot of reforms, made a lot of changes and a lot of improvements as a result. But we only did it by actually reforming some of those aspects of the state-run service and actually introducing the private sector into some parts of our healthcare.
Are you happy with the current system as it stands?
In the UK?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think that we, the reform programme has... I mean, the interesting thing is our healthcare system was the biggest issue, or certainly one of them, but one of the very biggest issues around 1997, around 2001, and then suddenly not so much. And I think that's a consequence of the system having improved pretty radically.
But you think universal health care is a good idea for the United States?
That's up to you. Look, I don't decide your
but
policy.
You have an opinion on that.
Look,
I mean, you know about skyrocketing health costs.
Yeah,
you know
of course.
About all the issues about health care.
And in the UK, you know, that's the system we want. And obviously, I think, you know, I've always had the belief personally that access to decent health care should be there even if you're poor or destitute. So I think it's important. But, you know, how you reform your system, that's up to you. And honestly, I'm not an expert on it. All I can tell you is the interesting thing, I think, is that what most countries around the world are trying to do today is to combine the universal nature of the state-run system, right, the universal coverage of the state-run system.
With some choice.
With the more flexible, competitive, choice-based system that is in private insurance. That's what I think, that's the kind of alchemist stone that people are looking for.
Let me ask you about some domestic issues brewing back in the UK. Will you speak publicly about the fiscal scandal in Parliament, 200 members accused of misusing funds meant for secondary homes?
Look, I'm really sorry, Katie. I don't comment on UK politics anymore. And I don't... The reason I don't is I said when I left office...
This isn't about, Gordon Brown.
I know,
this is about all these...
But anything I say, I mean, I've learned that anything I say is... kind of, as they say, taking down and using evidence against me in terms of interference with UK politics. And it's a tough enough job for the people who I've left behind in government without me interfering in it.
Is that position informed by the fact that John Major used to take shots at you when you were Prime Minister? And did that really bug the heck out of you?
It never bothered me, to be honest.
Oh, come on.
No, I mean, it didn't bother me partly because if I can say, I didn't think they were very effective. But
it irked you a bit.
Well, it didn't particularly irk me, but I don't think it's sensible for people to do that. I mean, look, I sat in the chair, I did the job, I know how tough it is, it's really difficult, you get brickbats thrown at you all day, it's a tremendous privilege, don't misunderstand me, but it's tough, really tough, and it doesn't need the guy who did do the job coming along afterwards and giving so-called great advice, which is just basically a way of undermining the person who's doing it. I don't approve of it, and I've always made it clear, even if there's a change of government in the UK, and obviously I hope there's not, then I don't intend doing it to anyone, irrespective of what party they're in.
Turning back to Iraq, Mr. Blair, Britain soon begins its inquiry, as you know, into mistakes made before and during the war. Do you think these hearings should be open to the public? Because in published reports, they claim that you want them to be held behind closed doors.
Yeah, look, when people say to me, I mean, are you sort of worried about giving evidence or making statements or being questioned about Iraq in public? I'm questioned about Iraq in public the whole time. I have been for years. But the important thing about the inquiry is that it's actually about the lessons learned. And that's what we should do. It's not a political rerunning of the
Yeah, but you have to kind
debates.
of look at the past in order to understand the lessons learned.
Of course, and that's exactly what they'll do. And if the inquiry want me to appear in public, I do it the whole time. I mean, I'm doing it now.
You're perfectly content to have it open
Absolutely.
and for the public. A Twitter user named, I don't know how to say that. What would you say?
I'll have to get on my glasses. What is it?
Brokig Pojka.
Huh?
That's all right.
What's this?
Not sure.
I don't know. What's...
I don't know either. But
yeah.
Anyway, ask, why did you stay in lockstep with the Bush administration, even though it cost you politically? You know, you were called Bush's poodle, much to your dismay, I'm sure, for a while there during the run-up to the war and the invasion of Iraq. And I guess the question is, why were you so loyal to President Bush in terms of his position on Iraq?
Because I believed in it. And I believed it was in my country's interest after September the 11th to be shoulder to shoulder with America. I stuck to that position. I believed that we were right to take a completely different view of the security risks that our country faced. And in the end, you know, politics is a business in which ultimately there's no point in being in it unless you do what you believe. Now, that's not to say we don't all make our little compromises.
Deals with the devil.
Yeah, and all of that stuff. And, you know, of course, I'm not sitting here playing Mr. Naive or Mr. Innocent in terms of the business of politics and the difficult side of it. But on an issue like this, you do what you believe. And I always made it clear, I believed definitively that after September the 11th, we had to take a completely different view of the security threat that we had, and we had to act, and we had to be prepared to stand up and fight for what we believe in. And
even though there were no WMDs, you still feel it was the right thing to do?
Yes, because I think if you look at the region today and you ask, would this be a more stable region if Saddam Hussein and his two sons were still running Iraq? My answer to that is no. And the fact that we removed Saddam after 2 months. We then spent years fighting the exact same forces that we're fighting all over that region. And when they were fighting us, we should be, as we were, and your troops were, and our troops, prepared to stand up and fight back.
I've heard you defend Iraq, and I'm just curious because I never hear anyone follow up with the question, what about the notion that the war in Iraq was the biggest recruiting tool al-Qaeda could have asked for?
And my answer to that is that the day we end up believing that when we get rid of a brutal dictator, give the people the chance to vote for a democracy, put a vast amount of aid behind it, that we are recruiting people to terrorism, is the day that we've got our values absolutely upside down. The people who are responsible for the terrorism in Iraq, in Afghanistan, all over the region, are the terrorists. And when we go in there and we actually offer people a different start and a new way of life, and they vote for it, which they did, we're not provoking terrorism. And incidentally, the people who are the victims of those terrorists are their fellow Muslims. So the people who drive car bombs into crowded markets and blow up the first 50 people they see, I mean, nobody's provoking that.
Final Twitter question, which I'm hoping you can just mention what you're doing with Face to Faith and your Faith Foundation. Number 2L asks, what does Mr. Blair do on a normal day now that he's not in office? And I'm assuming much of your time is spent on your Faith Foundation. Can you briefly explain to people what you're doing? Because it sounds like you're doing some incredible things.
Yeah, I mean, two great things that we're doing with our foundation, which is about bringing religious faiths together, is one, we're linking up schools across the world of different faiths, so that as part of their religious or cultural education, kids in different countries across the faith divide get the chance to interact with each other and learn about each other and learn about each other's faith and so on, which is one thing. And we got 15 countries involved now, and another 17 are applying to come as part of the program. And that's a fantastic program. It's going to be really, really important, I think. And the second thing we're doing is we're partnering the United Nations anti-malaria campaign, mobilizing faith communities in the wealthy part of the world to help the fight against malaria. And in Africa, where 1 million people die every year preventably from malaria, the majority of them children, we're mobilizing the faith communities so that even where there isn't a health clinic or a hospital for people to go to, you've got a church or a mosque in every village where people can come to and get the bed nets and the medicines and the health education. And so, this is all part of showing that actually religious faith can be a positive, constructive and progressive force in the 21st century. It doesn't have to end up with us all fighting each other.
Can you really penetrate the extremism that exists, though?
Yeah, you can. Of course you can. And one of the ways of inoculating people against this extremism is at an early age to have kids understand what the other's about. So if I'm brought up a Christian, I never knew anything about Islam. Now, in my adulthood, and I'm learning about Islam, it's fascinating. And I see so many common roots and common heritage and so many common values. It's the world that we're creating today, which is a world driven by the force of globalization, is pushing people together. In that world, religious faith can be a positive, it can be a humanizing force, it can actually show us how people can exist together peacefully, or it can become, and in some cases is, destructive, sectarian and divisive.
Matthew Doyle, who is your chief of staff, is going to wring my neck if I ask you any other questions. You're on your way to the train station going to Philadelphia. You're all over the place. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm doing that. I'm going to do something connected with my faith foundation. So.
Well, thanks so much for actually stopping by and spending some time talking with us. It's always a pleasure to hear your viewpoints. And are you enjoying not being prime minister anymore? It must be kind of liberating.
It is in a way, yeah. I mean, and also the great thing is you focus on what you want to focus on. Whereas when you're prime minister, you focus on whatever comes across your desk.
Now I'm seeing some flop sweat on Matthew's forehead. So
we missed the train.
Thanks to all of you for watching. I'll see you later on the CBS Evening News. And of course, you can always follow us on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. For Mr. Blair, Matthew, and me, Katie Couric. See you later.